Well, it looks like we have a few here, and that's just fine. I'm going to introduce myself to, if you guys don't know me, my name is Justin Matley. I'm a resident here in Norwalk. I'm a father of two girls, one who is entering kindergarten. So this topic is extremely relevant for myself, and I know for a lot of you here in this in the community. Just a couple top line things really quick before we get we get rolling here. I just asked that if everybody could turn off their microphones. That would be super helpful. I want to make sure that there's no interruptions. If you have a question at all, feel free to ask it in the chat window over there. And if there's any time left over at the end for more casual back and forth, you're more than able to we get more of a dialogue then. So, in any case, I'm an audio producer, I'm an educator, and I'm so happy to have a friend and colleague here. He's the Associate Director of Digital Media and Design Department at UConn, and he's someone much smarter than I, and on this topic, but a lot of things. I do these chats pretty regularly before COVID. I ran was called a Discuss Norwalk group, where we engaged on some topics related to politics and education and across the board in our community. And we did one with a friend who's an epidemiologist soon after COVID hit in March. So this is the sort of the reignition of this chat. So Matt, thank you for being here.
Thank you for organising this, Justin. I think it's great. And as a parent of three little boys, I'm also looking forward to the conversation with other parents and educators.
Fantastic.
Full of action. I love it.
So just to outline what Norwalk is doing here, because that's sort of the crux for our chat here today, but there's going to be lots of aspects of this that are pertinent to all kinds of communities throughout the country. Our K through 5 here is doing a model where students either in or out. So they can opt in to 5-day-a-week in-class learning, or they can opt out into fully remote learning. The hitch here, and this is the hitch for teachers and parents alike, especially teachers, is the balance of the same teacher is responsible for both the in-class component as well as the room as the learners from home. So, and there's an opportunity for some of those learners can come into the classroom and out of the classroom at sort of defined intervals during the year. 6 through 12 is operating on a what is they're calling a hybrid model. So, and what that means in this case for 6 to 12 is that there's going to be some days in, some days out that are based on cohorts. So it's half the class in, half the class out on certain days, alternating days, and there's going to be some asynchronous learning from home as well. So it's all very complicated and it's changing all the time, and I'm sure it's going to change again. So what I would love to start with here is sort of breaking out the ages here. Some choices were made by this city that I think are pertinent for the age groups that we're talking about. And I would, Matt, I'd love to get your thoughts, just some top line consideration for how kids learn at different ages, and how much technology, whether that be software, devices, all of that, can either facilitate that learning process or actually compromise their experience. So I would love to hear your sort of top line thoughts on that.
Justin, forgive me. I heard the question. Was that directed to me?
It was.
Okay, so I'm actually right now dealing with something that I'm sure we've all experienced with homeschooling, which is that my youngest, who's 3, is not understanding that I'm on a call right now. And he keeps asking me to get a toy at the top of his shelf. So I keep saying 5 minutes. We'll see how long that 5 minutes response lasts. I think the takeaway is that this is where we are today. This is the plan. Given anything to go on from what we've experienced in the last 6 months, we should all remain flexible to the fact that this situation is going to change. The situation might change next month, in a couple of years from now. I think from an educator perspective, we have to understand that it's going to be very, very difficult for learners in these different situations to experience learning in the same way. So let's just take that group who are those teachers in the early years who are having to teach students in a more traditional setting in the classroom, while also having to reach those learners that are having their learning at home. That's going to be a really challenging job for them. And it is a job that no one has been trained to do. And it is a job that they are going to be doing for the very first time. And so I think as parents, we're going to have to be patient, perhaps more patient than what we were during COVID. I know that many of us were grateful to the schools for the support and effort that they did during that time. There might be a tendency for us to say, well, you've had all of the summer to prepare for it. Well, actually, no, unfortunately not. That's not necessarily how school districts works. The teachers haven't been conducting training throughout the summer. And so we're going to have to provide as much support as we can. So I think that the ability for us to be flexible is going to be super important. You want to grab that, Justin?
Guide them through questions they have as they navigate, their new role here. And I think a lot of that is, some of the...
Please, Liverbird, would you please mute your mic? That would be super helpful.
So that's going to be kind of the first building block of the program.
I don't think I'll...
Liverbird, would you please mute your mic?
All right, so
please mute your mics.
And you know what we're experiencing now. Just imagine you've got 6 or 7 year olds, right? Like the teacher is going to have to be dealing with this, right? Yeah. While they're also dealing with this traditional class environment. And I think it might take a couple of weeks for them to get into their stride. So I think the educators need to be patient and give themselves a break. They're going to have to be sensitive to the situation. I think the key in all of this, Justin, is communications. That the parents should not feel uncomfortable reaching out to the teacher, asking clarification questions, even offering suggestions, and also sharing how they're experiencing it on their side, because that is providing the teacher with the information they need to make improvements to their practice. The teacher is going to have to likewise try and be as open in their communications with the parents, and try and be receptive to the information that they're receiving from the parents, and also just be aware that they might feel that they've got it down in a nutshell in the first day, and by the end of the week they might begin to say, oh well, perhaps that worked really well, but at some point they're going to probably have some self-doubt and challenges along the way, and they're going to have to trust that process. But just constantly remember that we're all in this together, and we all have got the main goal is to try to deliver the best possible education for our children under these circumstances. So maybe that was a little bit of a kind of philosophical response to your question, Justin.
Well, that's a good start.
We have to remember it. We have to remember that.
I think it's very helpful to have that as a top line sort of thought as we all enter this. It's just to go back to my original question. stark differences between how kids learn, whether they're 5 or 6, if whether they're 9 to 10, or high school, middle school, all the different groups of kids. How can technology facilitate this process for those kids, or compromise it at times? And what I'm asking about specifically is use of devices at home, in the home environment, as they're engaging with classrooms. Are there distinct periods of time we should be thinking about? Are there, we're all zoomed out these days. We're exhausted by it, but at the same time, it's become such a critical component of our lives. So give me considerations in terms of how kids should be utilizing software and devices at the younger age groups, and how that is in contrast with high schoolers using it.
No, I understand that question. Yeah, and I think that's important. So first of all, I take the approach that technology is a tool, right? And it's a tool, and the way that tool is used as part of the learning experience is really dictated and controlled by people. It's controlled by the parents, it's controlled by the students who are using the technology, and of course also it's dictated by the teachers and how they are designing learning experiences that utilize these tools. I think we have to remember that technology in itself is not video games. I know that when I've worked with parents before, or had this conversation with parents, there are very highly elevated concerns around the amount of times young children, or children of all ages, spend playing games. And I think that is a separate conversation to be had. When you say zoomed out, yeah, we've been utilizing Zoom a lot. I personally, as a parent and also an educator, am not overly concerned about the use of Zoom per se as a technological tool, because I think many of us are familiar with using FaceTime, whether it's connected with aunt, uncles, grandparents. I think that is something that is now embedded in young children's lives at a very early age. They're used to that. I think that the other part of the technological aspect that the parents, the ones that are schooling at home, are going to have to be really aware of, is the amount of time the children throughout the day are on the technology. And I think this is why it's really important to have open communications with the teacher. So I was working with the principal of my children's school, and we surveyed some of the parents around kind of late March, early April, just to kind of get a sense of how they are experiencing this homeschooling dilemma. And there was a lot of concern about the amount of time that children of all ages are sitting in front of a computer. So if you think they've got the 9 o'clock, Zoom call with someone, then they're working on Zoom with small groups, and then they're on the Google Classroom, and then they're on the Seesaw, and then maybe they want to squeeze in playing some video games, and then they're maybe chatting to the grandparents. That is a lot of time throughout the day that children are spending on the computer. And I think very early on, that aspect of this dilemma wasn't necessarily being processed by all teachers. And it shouldn't have been, because they just don't have the time to consider that. But I think parents who are homeschooling their children at home, and unfortunately, I think that it's possible that we're going to see maybe a lockdown at some point during the calendar year. You've got to take control of that. You've got to communicate to your child. If you to your teacher again, if you're feeling that your child is on that computer for a long time, right? You've got to, I think the parent, I believe, is going to have to get involved and find ways to break that day up. And if the schedule of the school is a little bit too rigid, that they feel like they're going to be missing stuff out, you've got to find a way of communicating that. And likewise, watch those Zoom calls, right? You've got to look at a Zoom call for 50 minutes. If you're noticing that your child is struggling with attention after 15, 20 minutes, again, let the teacher know. This is only, it's weird, I'm back to communication. This is only going to work if we're communicating. And then, of course, let's touch on the video games. Yeah, we have to be aware if your child is on YouTube for 1 or 2 hours a day, and then they tend to do some gaming play for 1 or 2 hours. And now you're adding an additional 5, 6, 7 hours as a consequence of schoolwork. Unfortunately, it's going to be a pain in the butt, but we're going to have to probably get involved and provide some more structured time and more rigid structures for our children. And we might have to go, and I'm sure we're all aware of this and talking about this, get them outside and get them doing physical activities, get them building Legos, even if it's a case of doing what you can to bribe them with some kind of more hands-on tools each week. You introduce a new item into their environment each week, even if it's just paper and crayons, but trying to do what you can so they're not exclusively on the technology. But to summarize, technology is a tool. I believe it can assist us in solving some of these instructional problems that we're going to have moving into the year. But we don't want too much of it, and we need to constantly monitor the impact it's having on our child in the home environment.
You would, if you're on, would you mute your mic, please? Mute mics, super helpful. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. That's really helpful. And I think part of what's freaking teachers out and parents out about either the sort of the synchronous asynchronous aspect, or especially the K-5 level here, when the teacher's responsible for the in and out, is the fact that the expectation is that the home learner in the classroom environment, there's sort of a dichotomy here from the parents want to have their child involved with their class, they're in class, and this is referring to the learners at home, as much as possible, because they want to feel like their child's getting the most out of the day. But but there's also the trade-off of a child 6 hours on a device trying to learn with their class, and the teacher trying to manage that as well is a huge ask. So are there any sort of practical considerations for parents at home with regards to sort of, I think I want to back that up.
I think I've got,
see, like, because what I'm thinking about is, Seesaw for the younger kids. That's what we're employing here. Google Classroom is going to be used for the older kids. And then obviously at high school level, there's more opportunities for projects to workshops, to lecture-based remote learning. Any sort of thoughts in regards to the advantages of different pieces of software and how they can facilitate the process for both the teacher and the parent?
Yeah, I think, again, I don't want to go back, but I still stand from the position that technology is a tool. The teacher is designing the learning experience that's utilizing that tool. The parent who's educating the child at the home has to think about how that tool is actually being deployed in their home environment. So with all the best intentions from an educator's perspective, that tool may not be utilized. And there's technological challenges that we're all going to experience. I think some of the challenges with these questions is we are going to have the teacher, when they're designing a learning experience, they don't know the setup of every home. I would really encourage educators from the start to use something like Google Forms and go and get data, information about your children's environments. Know what device they're on. Know their bandwidth. Go and use speed test. Like, get them to conduct a speed test, so that if they're constantly having bandwidth issues, you can go to your spreadsheet and say, wow, that home has only got 7 megabyte download. And then go and, it's a lot on the teacher, but then go and look at Zoom and say, well, if they don't have their video on, then they might be able to engage more effectively with less technological issues. So go out there at the very beginning and gather all the data you can about the home environment. But at the same time, at some point, the teacher is going to have to make some assumptions about how the learning is taking place at home in order for them to effectively design a learning experience. And going back to this question, what's really difficult is I want to start tapping into the learning sciences. I'm not an expert in that, but I have enough to answer that question. But the difficulty is that then you start moving into the pressures of being able to be a parent at home, dealing with your day job, while also addressing what ideally the learning sciences is saying that needs to happen at the child. So what I would say to educators and parents is that one of the concerns I have is feedback. Feedback, we know, right, is so important to the learning process. If we think about how we construct knowledge about that world, the idea of learning is building on your existing knowledge or reshaping that knowledge, challenging it, because sometimes you have something that's wrong. And typically there's so many different ways you can engage in feedback, but feedback is so much more than providing a grade or kind of like a numerical value to a piece of work that's gone in. Feedback is, hey, am I getting this right? And your response to that question. Feedback is, hey, why did they do this? Or what happens if I do that? And the child is getting a response. And so from an educator's perspective, you've got to say, what are the technological tools out there that allow me to provide that feedback? So if you're using something like Seesaw at a young age, or even Google Classroom with the higher grades, there are features that allow you to provide that individualized feedback. But it's not just a case of giving the feedback. You want to also make sure the feedback's being received. And so you've got to think about what are the technological solutions that exist out there in order for you to do your very best. You're not going to solve every problem, but do your very best to make sure that that level of feedback is still being sustained. And teachers on the call will know the different forms of feedback and different forms of assessment and how that plays its part. From a parent perspective, and going back to my own personal experience, knowing how important feedback was during the COVID outbreak, and it burnt me out, but I would watch my son interact with the technology and kind of rush through the work. And there was times the teachers did an amazing job at getting them to show their work and providing feedback in that moment. But going to the asynchronous learning piece, it was when they had the worksheets or the activities where they were doing it unaided without the support of an adult in the room. I would get the sheet back, and you could see that sometimes particularly my 9-year-old hadn't fully understood the problem or task that they were being given, and so they were slightly off. They had particularly new, I remember when fractions, they introduced fractions. It was one of the few units that was introduced completely during the lockdown. And I was really nervous about the fact this was a brand new unit, because, you know, you have certain holes in that knowledge that could then go and impact, you know, future activities in math, because you haven't got a solid foundation in it. And so I was trying to provide feedback. I'm not gonna lie, I was starting to get lost with the phrasing of the sheet. And so again, I engaged with the teacher and specifically asked them to make sure there's a better form of feedback, because I was saying my son just isn't getting it. So if you can't give the feedback, you've got to at least find a way for you to identify whether or not your child needs a little bit more feedback, and then go and advocate for them and ask for that feedback to take place. And again, it's on the educator to think about the technological solutions that they're doing in order to provide that feedback. But that's kind of my response to that question. It's a loaded question, Justin, but really keep thinking about feedback.
Yeah, so I want to get a little bit, I'm going to rant here for one second here, because I want to get kind of into the nuts and bolts a smidge here with regards to sort of what teachers and parents are going to have access to, right? So if you look at the full spectrum of what our district is providing. So K-2 is providing tablets to all of the students in our district, and they provide Chromebooks from 3 through 12 for everyone in the district. So all the students we know are going to have this piece of technology, whether it be at home or whether it be in the classroom, as a means to interact with the kids who are at home. They're also going to be provided, and I don't know if this is news for everybody here as well who is in town, but they're also going to be provided headsets with microphones as well. And I think this is very important that everybody's sort of on the same sort of even keel with regards to the technology they have access to. So we're sort of operating in the same platform here. And also the kids that are in school as well are going to have access to the headsets and the mics. The teachers are either going to have a headset and mic, or they're going to have some other form of mic. And there are a few kind of options here. And I would like to talk about what, and I don't know which teachers are going to receive what, but there are certain kinds of pieces of technology that are more conducive to different kinds of experiences in the classroom that are really important to talk about. So one is a plate mic, and there are going to be a handful of teachers that are going to receive a plate mic, and that's a kind of microphone that is conducive to like a conference room very often. So you'll find it on a table in a conference room. It's usually shaped like a little, it could be a rectangular octagon or a little square. It sits in the middle of the room. It's omnidirectional. So it captures audio from all around. So if a teacher is provided this kind of microphone or wants to purchase this kind of microphone on their own, this is the best opportunity for you to do interactive experiences, learning group experiences in the classroom. It's called a plate microphone or a conference room microphone. The advantage of whether you're using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or like Hangouts or something is that you have the option to choose your video device input in your audio device input. So you're not beholden to whatever microphone is built on into your computer. I think in terms of cameras, most people are going to be just based on availability of technology, and because all classrooms are buying up this stuff, is that most people, in terms of teachers, are going to just have the camera that's on their laptop, and perhaps be provided an auxiliary microphone they could use. So I think it's really important to think about what tools you have and how to best use those tools. So like I said, if you're doing if you have a plate microphone, really great for workshop, group-oriented things. The kids can still sit 6 feet apart, but sort of be staggered out. And I know that Cranberry, based on a town hall yesterday I saw, and I'm sure other schools are experimenting with this, while the kids have individual desks and they're 6 feet apart either way, they're not all facing the same direction. They're kind of in cohorts sort of facing each other and a little bit, and that allows a little more interaction. So this is sort of a nice environment to use that kind of microphone. The teacher can use an outside webcam as well if they are provided one or if they have one. This is an opportunity there could be occasions where if you're doing sort of a lecture oriented kind of class where perhaps it makes the most sense to use a camera, and you can use the laptop camera built in that faces you, and you're speaking outwards towards the class, but always be conscious of the fact that if you are engaged with remote learners, that they exist on the camera and their eyes are the lens of the camera, right? So I think it's very important, especially kids of the younger age, that I think it's very, very easy to look out into the classroom amongst the kids. And I think it's, or you're looking on the screen down here, but I think one thing that's going to be really important and sort of kind of lost and I always thought about is to make sure that if you want to look in the eyes of your students, you're actually looking in the eyes of the camera. So I think that's sort of just a quirk to think about and sort of have in the back of your mind. I think with the sort of these options and how you use different pieces of technology for what kinds of things, for me, and this is something, and I was on task force in this town, and I know there's some others in this call right now that were on it as well. One thing I tried to push from the technology side of thing, and I also pushed to the super, was that these teachers, especially the teachers that need to balance the in-school, out-of-school students, really have an opportunity to subdivide their day. I don't personally, and I'm not in charge of this, but I don't personally think that 6 hours of constant remote learner time is useful. For something like me, is I feel like maybe 1 or 2 good chunks of time during the day for the remote learners being engaged hands-on with the in-school people is useful, and those can be used in very smart ways. So for instance, you could use, if you have the right technology to utilize for the group stuff, you hole up and isolate, say from 9:30 to 10:30. You're doing a workshop with these kids, and you can use whatever types of piece of technology and have time to set it up for the best engagement with those students in that way. And then perhaps you isolate a chunk of time later on that's sort of a check-in time for the rest of the kids, where then you have the opportunity to adapt the environment or adapt whatever technology you have for that period of time. Because I think, and this is based on my conversations with Matt in the past and what he remarked on today, is I think we have to be very conscious, especially for the kids that are younger, that they aren't going to sit in front of a laptop or the tablet for 6 hours and get anything out of it. And also there's going to be times where the kids just losing their mind, or they're busy, or, you know, they're hungry, or they're at home too. So, or even the kids in class who perhaps they're in kindergarten, it's their first experience in school environments. Some kids will have at preschool, but others wouldn't have. Or they're just sort of a kid that's a little more rambunctious, you know, and that's fine and wonderful. And this environment is going to be a little bit harder to facilitate those kids. So I think, and Matt, I'm going to toss this back at you. And if anybody has any questions regarding like use of technology, I'm not going to dive too deeply into like this plugs into that and check this input on this thing. But if anybody has any of those kinds of questions, you can reach out to me offline. I'm always available to talk about different use of microphones and what makes the most sense for what kind of situation. I don't want to dive too deeply into that because I know those questions are very individualized kinds of questions based on the tools that you have. But yeah, I think top line is understanding what tools you have and then trying to adapt those tools in the best way that makes the most sense based on how your kids learn, based on how old they are, and based on the kinds of lessons that you're doing. But I think that's
Justin,
yeah.
Just to jump in, because I think you're making some really good points about the idea of the tools and their relationship with the environment. And there's certain things that probably I took for granted with my school setup that maybe not everyone has been thinking about. The eye contact is something that my kids' parents were quite focused on, making sure that the camera's eye level. I think that's a great idea. I think anyone that is kind of like got folks going to kindergarten for the first time and going to be using this Zoom, think about the work environment. Where is the place in your home where your child is going to be working? That's their work environment. When they're sitting there, you got to kind of like establish a kind of routine where they kind of like have the school hat on, student hat on. I know it sounds a pain in the neck, but I would have to go through the ringer with my middle child a few times because he hated his elbows. He was trying to draw, and so you had to kind of like, there wasn't always room at first to have the computer and then like a drawing space in front of the computer. Then he was bumping his elbows. And so I'm trying to work with my eldest boy while also thinking that the Zoom call is just being run by the teacher. But because I actually hadn't thought about the workspace and the work environment, I always kept getting pulled in to my boy because he was just getting frustrated, and that frustration was then coming into the class. So do think about the tools and their relationship with the environment. And then you mentioned lunch, for example. I would make it, when I knew that there was more of the chunky Zoom sessions, some of the teachers had made a request that children don't eat while they're taking the Zoom calls. I have mixed feelings about that, especially when Zoom calls are being held kind of like at lunchtime. But nevertheless, what I would do is I'd try and make sure that they were getting food just before the Zoom call. And so I built that into my routine as well. It seems, a little bit tedious at first, but once you get into that routine, it will help you out. There was other things that I did is that I took the time to teach my child how to find the Zoom link. And so I had the web browser, and I put in the top, I went and bookmarked every single link they would need. I bookmarked Seesaw, I bookmarked Zoom, I bookmarked everything. And then every week I would go into the Zoom calendar and I would kind of like have all of the passwords, all of the times of the calls written. And my 9-year-old, for example, I could just put it up next to his computer in his work environment. And he got in the habit of being able to access all of the Zoom calls by himself without any problems. With my 5-year-old, he wasn't able to do that, but he was able to go and click on the buttons, get the Zoom. I could then come in and quickly type in the password because it was right there. When I hadn't done that, I was constantly having to go into my emails and find all of these pieces of information. So there's some of the things that you can do. If there's teachers on the call, do think about the fact that you're getting that information to the parents really early. And parents, this is the thing that's frustrating, but my Monday mornings was always stressful, or Sunday evenings were stressful because I was prepping for the entire week, getting all those Zoom calls. But once the week was flowing, I had less impact on my daily life.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And it sort of just it sort of reaffirms the fact that if us as parents with 1 or 2 or 3 kids at home, and perhaps trying to work as well, if we can't manage it consistently, perfectly every time in terms of the balance between our life and our kids and their learning and not, then we can't expect the same out of teachers 6 to 7 hours a day either. So I think it just reaffirms once again that that a teacher needs to be able to look this way and look that way. They can't look always, they don't have eyes in the back of their heads as much as when we were kids, our parents said they had eyes in the back of their heads, see what we're doing wrong. I think it's very important that, you know, that things are just laid out in a cohesive way. And I think you're right. I think things will evolve as we go. There's going to be some things that don't work in the beginning that we need to be refined, and we need to be earnest and patient and open about that process. But I think as has defined and broken out, and as much attention can be spent looking one way and then looking another way, as opposed to trying to look always all at the same time. You know, it's like that philosophy, like, you know, a specialist in work, and you can be great at one thing, maybe 2 things, you know, and that's what they do, versus people who are sort of they're sort of okay at everything. And I think that's me. I think I'm like average at like a bunch of things, versus some people are super amazing in a handful of things. I think in this case, the same philosophy applies. It's like, let's not bite off more than you can chew at any point in the day, because that's going to allow the process to unfold, I think, in a smoother way. There is a question here from Ileana here in regard. So yes, I can answer this question. I'm mostly concerned for the underprivileged children that don't have a space for schooling. That's absolutely a concern. And there's absolutely a concern from the wider scale of them being engaged at all. I know there's a big drop off in the spring when things turned all remote, especially on the underprivileged communities. There was a drop off of engagement. There's a certain amount of that Norwalk as a district is trying to help. And that is with internet. So there's going to be free internet, whether it be if you didn't have internet and you need internet, or whether it be an internet speed that was too slow and is being upgraded. The city has a relationship with Altice and another company. I don't think it's Frontier. I think it's perhaps just Altice, but don't quote me on this. But the goal is to make sure that everybody across the board has an acceptable internet and speed. So that is in the process of rolling out.
Can I take the second question, just the second part of the question?
Yeah, just let me just respond from a Norwalk level here, and then and a parent isn't able to guide them through their day, or even Justin, do you know if there will be tech support available? Yeah, so there's going to be in our town here, there's going to be a depot where all the equipment will, if there's any problems with equipment, people can bring equipment, have it swapped out, have it repaired, and then swapped out for temporary device. There's going to be a place where that exists. There's going to be a hotline people call. I think it's an expanded version of what was done in the spring. It's going to bilingual hotline where people have any problems with devices, they'll be able to call. There's also going to be a web portal as well, sort of like Apple Care, where people can sign up for a day and a time where they can meet either virtually or in person or over the phone with a tech person to help them resolve their problems. So the answer to your question is, overall, to the majority of the questions here, is yes, there are going to be options available for people. And I think we're trying to move away from hot spots, because hot spots are, it really depends on kind of where you are. I think that the crux is trying to get fundamental internet for everybody. And a lot of the Hispanic community is not aware of all these. So, okay, yeah, no, so the technology committee has been working on this, and yeah, it will be, I don't know the official date or how it's going to be rolled out, but they're working on all of that for sure. Matt, you had something you wanted to add?
Well, just there's also a second question coming through. So are they communicating this to specifically to the Hispanic community and addressing the fact of the bilingual parents in that communication channel?
You know, there is, it's funny, you have to have access to internet and technology to help obtain the information. And if you don't have access to that technology, then you can't obtain all the information. Of course, part of this is trying to get people access to the technology. So as much as people who do have access to technology in that community, who have access to the city reopening website, as well as NPS website, and as newsletters get sent through, I know they're trying to do it every week or so now. As those things get updated, I think we are dependent on making sure that the people who do have access to those communities, or in those communities who do have access, to help ground level communicate this stuff. I mean, there's only so much NPS, although there have been some communication rollout challenges, I would say, over the last few months. Part of that, I think, is on, it's just based on the challenges of the environment and information changing daily. And I think some of that is sort of some fundamental communication problems that we may have sometimes, but overall is as much as we can. I think once school gets going and we develop relationships with the teachers, and the teachers can communicate some of this stuff to students and parents, and peers, and the parents in the classrooms can help pass it along. I think that'll broaden the knowledge base.
I mean, there's a reference about working with the comms committee here. I think, you know, I'm really trying to be sensitive on how I respond to this general issue, because, you know, I've just come back from the UK for a few months, and just generally Europe just have a completely different perspective on this. It's like kids must return at all costs. One of the reasons is because of equity issues. And, you know, we focus a lot on the challenge with, we focus a lot on the technology. Going back to what I referenced, feedback, for example, keeping open communication channels with the teachers. These are things that we know might be more challenging in certain, you know, home environments, and unfortunately might impact the underrepresented groups. The digital divide is well documented, how badly it's been exposed during this time. So again, you know, how much do you put on the teachers? Are we asking teachers to communicate information in 2 languages? Because I've just emphasized how important it is to maintain that open channel of communication. And also some subgroups in society are less likely to engage in teachers when compared to maybe more affluent white middle class families. And so I think teachers need to be highly sensitive to that issue. I think we need to look at tools such as Google Translate plugin. So if you're trying to engage in a discussion with parents, or even engage in a discussion with students at an older age, and you're using something like Google Docs, let's make sure that everyone you're communicating to is aware of the Google Translate feature, and maybe you as an educator are utilizing that Google Translate feature. It may not translate perfectly, but Google's got a lot better on that translate feature, and it so long as you're not kind of like using, you know, regional lingo, if you're using pretty standard words, Google Translate is a very effective feature. But again, the teachers have to be really sensitive to, again, that's why I think you've got to go out and get those surveys out. And even the survey responses is going to tell you something, right?
Oh, we know all about surveys here in Norwalk.
Right. So, but as a teacher, if you're reaching out to the parents of your students, And let's say you've got 30 students and you get a response rate of about 50%. If all of those response rate are white middle-class family parents, right, you've got to immediately understand that the perspective, the only perspective you've got at that moment is the white middle-class families. And so that data is now incomplete. In fact, that data is biased. You've got to be really careful moving forward because you're missing, right, a population that actually might need more support than anyone else, and you still don't have data on them. And again, my worry is that it's a lot of pressure on the teachers now to try and engage with those subgroups. So this is why we have to come together as a society, as a community, which Justin, you're clearly doing, but references about working with the comm teams, just be proactive, get in there now and open these channels of communication and maintain these channels of communication. And that doesn't just include how to use the technology, it includes like those little small moments of learning, such as the feedback features, right? Like, you know, hey, this is how you can engage with in a small conversation with your child. This is what to do if you feel like your child is falling behind, because they're not just technological issues that the parents are going to need support with, and the teachers are going to need support from the parents with.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think for us as parents who have you know have kids at home who are used to seeing in school are going to be dealing with sort of some learning variables, at least on a day-to-day basis, that we're not always exposed to with our kids. And I think it's be kind for us as parents to ourselves to sort of not try to fight that. And Matt, when we talked yesterday, you made a really good point. You know, if your kid is at home learning, especially a younger kid or special needs kid or anything like that, and they're just having a day or they're having an hour and they just need to step back and have a reset button, we need to be accepting and understanding and gracious, I think, with that. And I think teachers, I think teachers are going to be aware of that as well, and they're going to understand that, you know, when kids are in the classroom, there's a certain way of engaging personally with that kid, whether taking them aside and sitting with them and talking about what's going on. There's an intimacy that we are going to lack to a certain extent. Sometimes the kid needs a hug, right? And we have to be mindful that the kids need their space as well as us. And sometimes you're just going to have a day, you know, where that us as parents or teachers or the kids just aren't operating 100%. And we need to be responsive to that and allow that to allow it to happen as it happens. And if we have to take a step back as parents or kids to help, you sort of hit the reset button and restart the engagement. I think that's okay. All right. We have maybe like 10 minutes or so here. I had one more thought. Oh, I want to just shout out to teachers right now. I know that there's a lot of insecurities with all this and a lot of anxiety. I mean, we all have anxiety right now. There's always like a low level anxiety every day now that we've learned to sort of exist with, right? And I know teachers are trying to be conscious of themselves and their own health and well-being and abilities to take on all of this. They also want to be engaged with their students in an intimate way that helps facilitate their learning process. So I just want to give a lot of credit to all the teachers here trying their best in a challenging time. That's all. I wanted to add that. But for the teachers, they're walking into their classroom this week here. So they sort of have a week of buffer time right now in between when they're in the room every day and when the students arrive. So Matt, do you have any thoughts in terms of these teachers are walking into the room? What sort of, do you have sort of a stepwise process, like a very sort of practical process by which you think about going through to consider how they're going to manage all of this? Do you sort of have sort of a fundamental sort of like, I would consider this, then based on that, I would consider this, based on that, I would consider this? Do you sort of have some organized thoughts on that?
Well, walking, first of all, just to reiterate what you said, first of all, take a breath and walk into that classroom knowing that this year is going to be very different than anything you've experienced before, and trust the process. So the temptation for a teacher walking the room quite often is to look at their physical environment, the physical structure, and that physical structure represents the routines that they plan to implement during the calendar year. Unfortunately, those routines are going to probably be disrupted multiple times. And so walk into that room probably on the first day with a recognition that the way you're starting that setup may change. The other factor is, of course, there's government guidelines that have come in about how that room must be set up. And so you're going to have to kind of work with those guidelines a little bit. What I would say, though, is going back to the fact that we might have this hybrid approach, a lockdown at some point, or the fact that some teachers are going to walk in knowing that they've got some students that are at home and some students that are in the classroom, and that those numbers are going to fluctuate a lot as well, right? You might start off with 18 in the classroom and it might suddenly go and 10 at home, and then suddenly it kind of like flips over. You need to be able to adapt to that. You know, and that classroom, that physical environment needs to be able to adapt to that, and it needs to accommodate it. So if you are, for example, planning to utilize Zoom and have groups where students in the classroom are interacting with students at home, and you're going to try and maintain, I think this might be particularly challenging, but I also understand why it's appealing, is if you're going to try and maintain like different level groups, for example, where you might have students in two different experiences trying to come together, the environment's got to represent that, right? So you've got to have a space where 2 or 3 students can go to a computer at a table and interact with people at home. And you've got to think about, to your point, the technological issues of sound, right? Because you might not necessarily in that, if you're doing maybe a station rotation model and you're having those children work on their own in a group, you're not going to want to have to address technological issues. So you've got to be thinking about where is that group going to be situated. And likewise, you're going to probably need time in your environment, in that classroom environment, where you're working, either interacting with parents or working one-to-one with a child who's at home, or working with a group of children at home. And you've got to think about where is your environment. And also might consider thinking about the rules that you're setting up with particularly with the young ones. Maybe you establish some routine. Maybe there's a sticker on the wall where you say, hey guys, just for a moment, this is me working with the children in the home environment. And when you see this sign, I would like you just to be patient unless it's an emergency, because I'm now working with a group that's at home. And where's that environment? And so do think about where you are going to be physically located and where the students are going to be physically located when they're interacting with the home folks. But I think the big takeaway, Justin, is just know that environment represents a routine, and a routine that this year's going to change.
I think that's huge, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. But the idea of this, just having an understanding of what the space is, and you're right. If you're, for instance, if you are trying to teach the whole class, but also engage with the students, think about like where your computer is facing, right? So if you're working on your laptop trying to engage students with maybe a keynote presentation, understand that camera, if you're using that camera on your laptop, is facing you, it's facing, and someone say you and your teacher here, right? So an understanding is, if you're doing a lesson that has as a computer-based presentation component, know that the student is only looking at you. They're not looking at the class as well. Now, unless this is a Teams environment where they're all logged on at the same time. I think that's the goal here, but I would like to emphasize the fact that I think there's going to be some bandwidth challenges throughout all this. And I know that in our town, we've really upgraded our bandwidth. So the hope is that we can have situations where a teacher is using a computer, talking to the in-class, but also engaging with the class, and everybody's kind of logged on at the same time. But I predict scenarios where that's not going to work well. So I think idea of space is super important with regards to what you're saying, Matt, in terms of sound. If a student at home is in the environment where the whole class is speaking and doing something, they're going to be thrown off because they're not in the environment. They can't see and understand that something's happening over here. I can look this other way and ignore it. They may find that they're pulled in a few different directions, and it's harder for them to concentrate at home. And whether it's just a visual thing or whether it's a sound thing as well. Now, some of the schools are older in our city, and one advantage of that actually is some of the classrooms are much are larger, 1,000 square feet or even more. So the advantage of this is that I think what Matt was saying is on those occasions where you're doing the remote engagement and are trying to focus one or the other, is to have a separate space, isolated, that's really conducive to that process. Also to think about kids that are older, they're more able to engage on their own. So sort of cohorts and breakout groups that can do self-driven projects and workshops where there can be sort of a lecture that's given, half-hour lecture at the top of a period, and then spend the next half an hour broken out into these cohorts. I think those present opportunities to sort of subdivide attention in a way that makes the best use of the short amount of time that you have, maybe with your kids, but uses it in a productive way. I think one thing, and I experienced this in the spring when I taught a class. I taught 2 classes in the spring, and I know one thing I experienced right off the bat was that there wasn't any way for me to teach the online classes in the same way that I would approach the in class. These students do not want to hear me ramble on disfluent speech and looking different directions, for 2.5 hours, So I think it's really important to sort of, if you're a teacher, perhaps one who's been in the classroom for a very long period of time, who's going to try to want to remake the experience in the classroom and apply that outside, I don't think that always works well. I think it's very important to sort of take this year, or at least this semester, with a new look and understand that there's really some challenges, but there's opportunities to recreate a new kind of experience that isn't just trying to give a lecture, for an hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever, on Teams or Zoom or whatever, because it's, the engagement is going to be a problem.
Justin,
yeah.
could I just to come in on
Please.
that? I mean, I think you touched on that earlier, but I do think so. I one of the things that I tap into and starting to develop a growing interest in is this concept of teacher creativity using new technology. And I was going to share, I'm working on an app that I hope to publish in the next couple of weeks. And it's just really a tool to share some of the concept around that and a guide to help teachers through some individualized professional learning. But when we utilize technology, going back to it being a tool, I agree with Justin. I think there's some really exciting opportunities for us to begin to address some of the ongoing challenges that exist in education. I certainly would be shocked if we see snow days wreaking havoc on our calendar in the coming years after this situation. But at the same time, bear in mind, I want to emphasize, and I'm sure we're all on the same page, and maybe I'm beating to the drum on this, but there's already some very unique challenges with the approach that we're going under, that we're going to be implementing. Now's probably not the time to get too adventurous with technology. Now's probably not the time to get too adventurous with some of the activities you're doing. What I did with my class in preparation is I took my syllabus and I started to think about how I can run this syllabus within the learning environment that I have. And then I identified the tools that I needed to use in order to implement the activities that I wanted to do. I remember specifically about 2 weeks ago, I said to myself, I would love to get them to do a podcast. Usually I have in-class debates. And I said to myself, you know what, I could do this as a podcast. And I hit the brakes on that because I said to myself, now I'm introducing an extra piece of technology. And even though I'm super excited about doing a podcast right now, I said to myself, wow, this is going to be November time. I don't know what the setup is going to be. And you know, I've just got to focus on just delivering the course right now. And this might not be that semester to do the podcast. And so I had to rein my excitement for technology and doing creative things in the classroom in check. And going back to the teacher creative concept, what's the value? The technology that you're introducing should be addressing a problem of practice, an instructional problem. And you need to bring that technology in to address that problem. Then what you need to do is monitor how effective it's being in addressing that problem, conduct the tweaks, modify it so it's continuing to address that problem. Keep that focus, all right, this semester on just thinking about delivering the instruction to everyone in your class. Things like the feedback that I referenced earlier. Feedback is so important. So what are the technological challenges around providing feedback in this environment? What are the technological solutions you're going to experiment with? And then monitor its effectiveness based on whether or not you are actually delivering that feedback. The call factor for this semester, I think we need to be very cautious with. The big elaborate activities for this semester, we need to be very cautious with.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. All right, well, so Matt, I don't want to keep you. I'm willing to hang here for another few minutes here. If anybody has individual questions in regarding use of technology and use of mics and cameras and little things like that as they tweak their planning for at-home environment or the classroom environment. So I'm definitely willing to hang for those. But Matt, you're a busy guy. I don't want to keep you, but I want to say thank you for everything. Unless you want to hang out for any more questions, but I know you're busy and have to go.
I'll just say thank you for setting this up, Justin. I think what you're doing come together, all of you on this call today, coming together as a community. I can even see the questions on the right hand that they're definitely community orientated. So kudos to everyone in the call. It certainly fills me with excitement and hope during this time that we've got communities like yours coming together to address these problems. I'm also happy to be available. You know, if anyone has any follow-ups that they have, I'll stay on for a couple of minutes just to see if there are any questions directed to me, Justin. But sure. If there's not, I'll slip away quietly. So thank you to everyone. Good luck.
If you have a question, feel free to unmute. Going, gone. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. If you want to reach out to myself, I'm available on Facebook. Just find me. I chime in on groups all the time, for better or for worse. And yeah, thanks for being here. And I'm going to post this online for anybody to watch later on. So thanks again. Have a good day. Bye.